Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We in New Hampshire have received great media coverage on our contamination and got a very positive response. So this is very near and dear to me to chair this panel. So we are doing the local and investigative media coverage. We have three great panelists. The first one is Mariah Blake, who she is an award-winning investigative journalist, and she is the 2016 Murray Martyr Neiman Fellow in Watchdog Journalism at Harvard University. She's currently working on a book about plastics, focusing largely on Teflon and PFOA. Our second panelist is Sharon Lerner. She is an environmental reporter for the Intercept and a reporting fellow at the Investigative Fund. She is largely known for her 11-part series, The Teflon Toxin, and she tracks perfluorinated chemicals throughout the U.S. and around the world. Lastly, we have Emily Corwin. She is from New Hampshire Public Radio, and she covers southern New Hampshire. She's also one of 8 dedicated reporters with the New England News Collaborative. Her continuing coverage of water contamination in southern New Hampshire actually received a 2016 Regional Edward Murrow Award. So each presenter is going to talk about their own experiences and what they have learned and insight that they've gained, and then we are going to open it up to the audience for questions. So if you guys all just give a round of applause and welcome for our panelists. And Mariah Blake is going to be the first one up.
Well, I just want to start by saying how great and inspiring it is to see so many of the people who are doing important work on this subject all in one room. One of the things that's really struck me as I've heard the other people speak is just how many people had to stand up and go against the grain in order for us to learn all the things that we now know about PFAS. Looks like I accidentally advanced my slides. Uh-oh. Sorry. Okay. So this, several people have mentioned the Tennant family. This is the Tennant family on these slides. They're the ones who filed the lawsuit that essentially put PFOA on the map. What hasn't been mentioned is that a lot of Parkersburg residents were really upset that they stood up to DuPont. Their neighbors quit talking to them. Della Tennant, who is the woman to Walker, told me that sometimes they would walk into a restaurant and everyone in that restaurant would get up and leave. Do I need to get close to the microphone? So there are people in this room who have taken very big risks and who have made comparably big sacrifices. There are people in this room who have spent years struggling against what must have seemed like impossible odds, people like Joe Kiger, who just spoke, and Rob Balot. There are people who are doing painstaking scientific research, people who are going out into communities and organizing. And I just want to thank all of you, because without people like you, people like me would have nothing to write about. And also, more importantly, we wouldn't have made the progress that we've made in understanding these chemicals and in phasing at least a couple of them out. So I'm going to talk about my work now. When I tell people what I'm working on, the question I most often get is how I ended up on a topic so seemingly obscure as perfluorinated chemicals. And the answer is I came upon it kind of by accident. So in 2013, I published an investigative story in Mother Jones magazine about BPA-free plastics. These are marketed as the safe alternative to plastics that contain BPA, but in reality, most of them contain chemicals that are similar to BPA, chemicals that mimic the hormone estrogen. I also discovered in my research that there had been a massive tobacco industry-style campaign to suppress this information. So this story touched me very personally because at the time that I wrote it, I had a 3-year-old son. And as many of you in this room know, young children are particularly vulnerable to the effects of these chemicals, to the effects of PFOA, to the effects of endocrine disruptors. And I suddenly found myself in a situation where I was surrounded by plastics and chemicals that were potentially harmful to my son, and I had no way of protecting him. So, as other people have said, you can't shop your way out of this problem, I'm sorry. So I decided that I wanted to write an investigative book about plastics, and a lot of the information from my BPA-free plastics story had come from lawsuits. So I decided to look for other lawsuits involving other kinds of plastics, and I quickly came upon one of the complaints for the 3,500 individual liability lawsuits filed by Parkersburg residents. These are the cases that Rob Balot talked about yesterday. And it laid out the whole story that Rob Balot told, so how DuPont and 3M had begun collecting data on the toxicity of PFOA as early as 1961, how DuPont had hid these findings and continued marketing Teflon to the public, how the company had dumped millions of pounds of PFOA-laced sludge in or around public water supplies, and continued doing so even after their own testing found that the drinking water had levels of this chemical that exceeded their own internal safety standards. Needless to say, I was blown away by this information. This was not a time where Sharon Lerner's article, one of her articles came out shortly before mine, but before that, there hadn't been a lot of pieces that put all of this information together. So I was completely blown away. I ended up writing an article that told the story of PFOA through the story of some Parkersburg residents. That includes people like Joe Kiger. It also includes people like Bucky Bailey. Somebody mentioned him yesterday. So Bucky's mother, Sue, worked in the Teflon division of DuPont's Parkersburg plant when she was pregnant with him. This was in the early 1980s. And as you can see, he was born with some serious facial deformities. He also had serious breathing problems, so Sue was initially told that he might not make it through the first night. At first, Sue thought that his deformities were just a matter of bad luck, but when she returned to work, she found a memo on the locker room bench that said that industry studies had found deformities in the eyes of rats that had been exposed to PFOA, and she began to suspect that the chemical might have something to do with Bucky's deformities. While Sue didn't know it at the time, DuPont had been secretly monitoring her and dozens of other women. They had been taking their blood. They had them fill out questionnaires with questions about their previous pregnancies, their miscarriages, their menstrual cycles. And this is actually a memo from DuPont's then medical director. You can see that the goal of the program was to determine whether PFOA caused, quote, abnormal children. The results of this study were pretty stunning, and I believe that Ken Cook discussed this yesterday, but 2 of the 7 women whose pregnancies were monitored during the early months of the program gave birth to children with eye and nostril deformities that were very similar to the ones that had been seen in C8 exposed rats. So this is Sue Bailey talking about her experience. I don't have volume. Okay. Sorry, Sue. What's that? You know, it's okay because
This might work.
Okay. That's all right. I'll go ahead since we have limited time.
Okay.
So the article also looked into chemical regulation, particularly the 1976 Toxic Substances Control Act. The bill was actually the result of an unlikely collaboration between a Texas congressman named Eckert and a DuPont official named Richard Heckert. It was originally known as the Heckert-Eckert bill. Under this measure, tens of thousands of chemicals already in use were presumed safe and grandfathered in. So what happens when chemicals are presumed safe and grandfathered in is that it creates an incentive for industry to game the system. In other words, to manufacture doubt about the data linking their products to disease, because as long as they can create doubt, they can avoid regulation. Both DuPont and 3M have relied heavily on what are called product defense consultants, some of them with tobacco industry ties, to muddy the water when it comes to PFOA. Here's a solicitation letter that the Weinberg Group sent DuPont in 2003 after the EPA Scientific Advisory Board began investigating the health effects of PFOA, and there's also a number of other things happening during that period. Weinberg is the group behind the tobacco industry's White Coat Project, which was an effort to recruit scientists to discredit the science on secondhand smoke. And the second paragraph reads, DuPont must shape the debate at all levels. We must implement a strategy at the outset which discourages governmental agencies, the plaintiffs' bar, and misguided environmental groups from pursuing this matter any further. And there is a passage later on where the Weinberg promises to harness its scientific knowledge to create the outcome that DuPont desires. So this proposal must have made an impression because DuPont ended up hiring the Weinberg Group. It also brought in a man who had been acting deputy director of the EPA to lobby the agency. Here are a couple of papers that 3M commissioned from Exponent, which is very similar to Weinberg. They use what I would argue is scientifically questionable methods to cast doubt on the growing number of studies that have linked PFOA to cancer and immune problems. Now, unfortunately, these tactics have been very effective at thwarting federal regulation, as many people have discussed. And the result is that ordinary citizens and local officials in communities with contamination are often left to struggle with the issue on their own. So, as Michelle mentioned, I'm currently working on a book for Crown that focuses largely on PFOA and Teflon. I'm spending a lot of time reporting in Hoosick Falls. And Hoosick Falls is a good example of what happens, when there's no federal regulation and when communities are left to struggle with this issue on their own. This is Michael Hickey. In 2003, Michael's father died of kidney cancer. Now, his father had driven the school bus during the day, and he worked at a local plastic plant that made Teflon-coated fabric at night. And Hickey suspected that this might have something to do with his father's illness. So he sat down and he Googled Teflon and cancer, and the first thing that came up was the C8 Health study, which showed that there was a link between the chemical and his father's disease. So Michael buried himself in research. He eventually approached the local doctor who felt that there was legitimacy. The other thing I forgot to mention is that Michael had sat on the village board and knew that the public drinking water supply was just a few hundred yards down the river from the plant where his father worked. And so he and a local doctor approached the mayor, asked them to test the water. The mayor refused, so Michael paid to test the water himself. He and the doctor then spent the next year and a half lobbying the local government to inform the public that the water was contaminated and to do something to handle the contamination. So they enlisted the help of a lawyer. They launched a nonprofit organization called Healthy Hoosick Water. They quietly planted stories in the media. They held meetings with the EPA and later held a big community meeting that brought together thousands of people. Finally, in November 2015, the EPA issued a do not drink order, and this touched off a chain of events that eventually led to 7 million people in 20 plus states learning that their water was also contaminated with this chemical. And the story's a little bit complicated than that because obviously people like Rob Balot had been lobbying for the EPA to issue a guideline for a long time. Anyways, so as several people have mentioned yesterday, new data from Northeastern and the Environmental Working Group suggest that the number is actually much higher, so that as many as 15 million people are living in communities where the water is contaminated with PFOA and PFOS. And in many of these places, people find themselves in exactly the same situation that Hoosick Falls has been, sometimes a worse situation. So residents and officials, local officials, are left to struggle with the situation largely on their own. This is especially problematic in communities where the polluter is the largest employer and taxpayer, and that is the case in many of these communities. It puts the officials in a very precarious negotiating position. So that is all I have, so I'm going to hand it over to Sharon now.
Hello. I really want to, let's see if I can do this. There we go. Oh, it's not the right list. Okay. I really want to echo Mariah's gratitude. It is bizarre being here. I feel like I've spoken with almost half of you on the phone before, and I just want to, take the opportunity to thank you for your generosity with your time and for allowing me to call back again and again and again, saying, I don't understand. Can you explain again? Did I get this wrong? Thank you. Thank you for your work. So I'm just really happy to be here. This is, I wanted to put up my, basically what I'm going to be talking about is based on this series that I did that goes up through last year. And I was going to put the web address of it, but you can basically find it if you Google me and the Intercept. And there we go, the beginning of it. I promise not to talk about West Virginia. We've heard a lot about that story. I did write about that story in the first 3 pieces of this series. I want to take a brief moment and talk about the third piece just a little bit, which is about regulation. And how we called it how DuPont slipped past the EPA. I too want to take an extra moment to express a special gratitude to Rob Alott, whose documents made it possible to write this and many of the other pieces. We've all heard about the revolving door, right? I thought I knew about the revolving door, but reading through those documents, it really showed me how that door spins, the mechanics of how that works. Mariah mentioned that DuPont had the former number 2 EPA guy, the deputy administrator, a guy named Mike McCabe, who headed up their basically PFOA defense team. There was the person who succeeded him as number 2 at EPA, Linda Fisher, was with him as well on that team. And it was amazing to read through these documents, these depositions, and see the kind of really intimate interactions they had with the EPA. And the reason they had these close connections is because these were their former colleagues. They were working with them very recently, sometimes less than 2 years before, which is against some of the internal guidelines. But basically, there were these emails back and forth and calls back and forth. We need your help responding to this publicly. We need you to give out an assurance that these products are safe, that there's no danger here. And you saw it. The requests were met time and time again. And so we keep talking about there should be federal regulation. And why isn't there? Well, partly it really helped me to get acquainted with these documents, and I wouldn't recommend. I mean, if a lot of us have heard about what happened with the tenants, what happened in West Virginia, but if if there's one piece I would recommend going back and reading, it's number 3. Okay, moving on. So after writing about the EPA and what happened in West Virginia, and I should say that I got into this story thinking that I was writing about New Jersey. I knew a little bit about what had happened with the Drinking Water Quality Institute, and I thought, here's an interesting story about Chris Christie. And it kind of was. But of course, then suddenly, I forgot who it was that sent me something about West Virginia, and then, they called it C8, and the other people called it PFOA, and then I went, oh, those are the same thing. And then I read through one of the expert reports from West Virginia, and it all became bigger. So after the first 3 pieces came out, and that was in August of 2015, I got a bunch of email. One of the emails I got was from someone named Lori Cervera, and she lives in Willowbrook, actually. And she wrote to me and said, I have kidney cancer, and I have PFOA in my well water. And I just went, like, it just hit me the way, it's hit many of you long before that, and some of you after, just like, oh, she does not have the same recourse as the people in West Virginia whose legal situation in which, DuPont is bound to accept the causality. Here she has it's not just that she doesn't have that, she has the military. She has to try and see if she can get some justice from the military. So I went and met with Lori Severa, and I ended up writing a piece in November or something of 2015 that talked about not just Willowbrook and not just Pennsylvania, but that there was firefighting foam that had contaminated, that was what we called it, that had contaminated drinking water throughout the country. And I think I talked to Andrea, I write about Andrea in this piece, and Pease. And I know we've seen a lot of interactive maps, but this one we were so proud of. It was this feat of journalism in that we used the UCMR data, and it was 2015, and we also got the sites of the fire and crash training sites from the military, and I used that journalistic technique of, it was one of those things, how are we ever going to get that? Well, I called them up, the DOD, and I asked for it, and they gave it to us. So that was my feat of reporting. But it was pretty amazing, and they gave us the actual coordinates, and so we put together a map. From there, I went to, I didn't go, but my reporting took me to the Cape Fear River. And this story is based on the work, in part reports on the work of Andy Lindstrom and Mark Striner, who we heard from Andy yesterday. And it was this crazy story that took me a very long time to wrap my head around. This is a picture of them, or actually of one of them. That's not Andy in the hat. But I think that's Mark and someone else. I don't know who the other guy is. But what they're doing, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, Andy, they are basically taking water samples from the Cape Fear River, and they're going to use that mass spectrometry to figure out what chemicals are in the river. And they're doing it right downstream of a DuPont, now Chemours plant. And this is not because someone somewhere at the EPA didn't know. Let me change all those double negatives. Someone at the EPA knew what they were emitting because they're required to report it. But it was CBI. So 2 minutes? How's that possible? Okay, so, okay, very quickly. Okay, so basically, here's what happened. As we know, it was Gen X, but this is our tax dollars at work. Here, they're like having to reverse engineer this thing that we should know about, right? And so what I did was, once we knew, I knew from his paper what the chemical was, it was CBI initially. So what's in there? What is it actually? There was this amazing paper by a scientist based in Zurich that published the CAS number. Using that, which is the unique identifier, using that I searched and got some 8E reports, which are basically the adverse incidence reports, which were on the EPA website. And this is what I found, that basically there were 16 reports between 2006, 2013, I think they were filed by DuPont. And here's what we found, that basically they cause reproductive problems, much the same basically effects as PFOA. And what I did was I shared them with toxicologists who were very familiar, some of whom may be in the room, and basically this is what they told me. Very quickly, that took me to the rest of the world, and when I was looking at the fact that these chemicals had spread to the rest of the world, it became very clear that they were mostly in one country, which we've heard about, and that is China. And one of the amazing things about working at the Intercept, where I've been while I did this work, is that when I told my editor, I think the next part of the story is in China, he said, well, you better go. So I went to China, that's the Chemours plant, And here is a slide I put together of basically this is PFOS production in the US, and you can see that line connecting them is 2002. And so what happens is production here generally is going up, drops off here, and one of the reasons I felt it was really, really important to go there was because while the technology had clearly made its way there, right? So they're now doing this production that we were doing. What has not made its way to China is awareness about the dangers at all, or about how to recycle it. And so, oh, there we go. That is the Shaoxing River. Whoops. And that's also the Shaoxing River. So I'll leave it, which ironically the name translates to clean and clear. But that is now where most of the biggest producer of Teflon in the world is on that river. They emit 350 pounds a day of PFOA directly into the river, dump it there, there's no filtration. And as a result, it has some of the highest levels in the world. And what else can I tell you? I'm now, unfortunately, this was the last piece in the series. That's the entry of a very big production complex in China. But here in that plant, it's basically like a city of perfluorinated chemical factories. And I took a picture of people fishing in the canals there. And one of the things that's amazing is that there are crops growing right up on the plants. People are raising, food there. So and fishing. This is a factory worker who, on his days off, fishes in the canal. So I know I'm out of time, but I just wanted to say I haven't written about this in almost a year, and it's not because I don't want to. It's because I've been completely busy doing all this other Trump-related EPA stuff, which of course is related to all this. And the last piece I did was about Susan Bodine, who is the person who's been nominated to be the lead the enforcement office, who also happens to have been a lobbyist for Saint-Gobain, a company we've heard a lot about. So I feel like I'm going to come back to these. I'm going to write about them more. I'm very interested in hearing from everybody. So thank you.
Hello, I am Emily Corwin. I'm a reporter with New Hampshire Public Radio. And I am the local part of this investigative and local reporting event. Being a local reporter is so different than doing what these guys do, and I rely on them a lot. What they've done is incredible and really informative for those of us who then respond to the very localized events that crop up and scare the crap out of people. The biggest thing that affects New Hampshire Public Radio's ability to address the multiple contaminations that have happened in our state at Pease, which I covered as a Seacoast reporter, down in Merrimack, which I cover as a Southern New Hampshire reporter, and all of the little towns around there affected. There's been contamination up in the Lebanon area near Dartmouth. The biggest roadblock is that when you go to Google and you type in what is PFOA, the CDC comes up and it says the following today. It says this: the human health effects from exposure to low environmental levels of PFOA are unknown. This just completely derails newsmaking. Couple examples. I have I'm making some weird mic noises here. I'm a public radio reporter. I should really know better. I'm going to back up a little bit. I think you can still hear me, and it doesn't hurt as much. So, a couple examples of the impact that sentence makes. I'm no longer covering water contamination. My colleague Jason Moon is, but Jason Moon and I were both fundraising, something that we had to do on the air for public radio. So my colleague, a former health reporter, Todd Bookman, was grabbing this news story that had just broken, which was that there was more perfluorochemicals in a new town, Windham, in New Hampshire, and we were like, I can't do it, who's going to do it? And Todd said, I can do it, thank you so much. And he finished the spot, and it goes on the air, and he comes up to me, and he's like, I mean, it's not a big deal. The CDC says their health effects aren't even known. And I was like, we need to talk. And he's a great health reporter, right? But it's incredible the power of authority, the infallibility of authority. And this is an instance now in this political climate. I think we may all question some things that the government says a little bit more than we once did, but certainly when a lot of these issues were breaking in a lot of New Hampshire towns, there was no reason to question what the CDC would say. And unlike Vermont, it's been interesting watching state government, unlike Vermont, which has been proactive in making their own decisions, New Hampshire has really looked to the federal government for guidance. And so what I found myself covering is something that's not super comfortable to be doing as a reporter, which is covering uncertainty itself. And the way that uncertainty gets exploited by people with varying motives, sometimes good motives. New Hampshire's health department has an epidemiologist who fears scandal. He doesn't want people to be afraid for no reason. He, I think, has a paternal, he feels a paternal sort of relationship to the people of New Hampshire. And so when he finds out that people are really, really anxious about this chemical that the federal government, which he sees as infallible, says is the impact is unknown, he feels it's his responsibility to quite try to alleviate fear by saying things like, the same number of studies show that there are no human health effects as show that there are human health effects, and so we just don't know, don't worry, right? I mean, they're still providing bottled water. They're testing the wells, under duress from the public. But as a reporter, I realized it somehow seemed to fall to me to try to fill in the gaps where I know that people like Carol are hearing from the state government. They're hearing, you have nothing to worry about. But then, you know how to operate Google. Yeah, and Sharon Lerner has on the internet information, like pictures of people who, know their lives have been turned upside down by this. And it's such a disconnect. And here I am in the middle of it, trying to figure out what my role should be as a local reporter, and it has not been easy. I've done some stories. I reported on that uncertainty, just what does it feel like to be looking online and seeing something completely different than what your trusted state epidemiologist is telling you. And why, so epidemiologists, what are you thinking when you, why are you saying these things? And talking to people, I talked to a 20-year-old who spent a year home from college because he was fighting thyroid cancer, and he was at home helping his dad who was dying from kidney cancer, and there was no history of cancer in their family. And he doesn't know whether PFOA caused it or not, right? I mean, he can guess, but he's not willing to say that he doesn't know. And uncertainty is miserable. And so what does that mean? What does that feel like? And it's not a satisfying kind of storytelling. And that's frustrating, and it's difficult. Another example of the impact of these, the CDC saying that the human health effects are unknown, is, for example, I had a lot of resources behind me in the New England News Collaborative when my editor said, I want to go deep on this stuff. We want to pull in NPR. Our editor, called up NPR. He said, like, we've got reporters in Vermont, in Connecticut, in New Hampshire who are fired up about this. And they thought about it, and we talked to them on the phone, and they came back and said, CDC says the health effects at those levels are unknown. Like, we're not ready to do it. And it's really tough to be stuck in between. And I can't imagine being the one drinking the water, right? So that's all I got to say. I don't know. It's a sticky situation. But the one thing I can say is I report on a lot of people who are marginalized, people who don't have a voice. I do a lot of criminal justice reporting. And if there's anything that I've learned about this, it is that, like, people who are drinking contaminated water, like, they know they have a voice. You guys you're loud, and you make a difference in terms of policy. You see that Vermont has set their standards at 20%, and you put pressure on, and people hear that. I mean, it's effective. So good job. All right, thanks.
So I just wanted to thank our panelists, and also I know that I have questions of my own, but I want to leave time and open it up to the audience. If the audience has any questions, I just shut something off. We can take questions from the audience. There's two, one in the back, and then we'll go to Andrea.
Hello, sir, ma'am. My name is Sharon. I'm a Northeastern student in the pharmacy department, and I'm partially taking classes for now, but I'm planning on resuming in academics since I've started it. So that was my brief introduction. So my question is, I believe that we all aim for a similar purpose of promoting integrity and going forward in an eco-friendly way. And as the sir from DuPont mentioned, that we're going to make eco-friendly water source and put it in a plastic bottle for an emergency method. But in long term, is there a way that we could lessen pollution so that we be more integrated with the whole earth? Is there a beneficial method right now that we could reduce pollution, as in manufacturing things, since manufacturing causes pollution basically, and I believe as humans we have to manufacture something to proceed, but at the same time we need to think about the nature and kind of go integrate. Is there a possible way that we could go as a whole, like a method?
Thank you. I think I'm not sure if that's necessarily a question for the journalist. I do think it's a good statement, and it's a good way to, that we all can collaborate and really think about how to move forward. That's definitely a community and with the scientists to move forward. So thank you for that. Andrea, you had a question.
It's not really a question, it's just more of a statement for all of you that I think, at least in the Pease community, the power of the media has been absolutely critical, and having more action and holding political leaders accountable, and also just trying to get the word out to the community. So it's really just a huge thank you to all of you and all the journalists that have helped, because we honestly, I feel like a lot of our communities wouldn't be where we are if it wasn't for people like you. So thank you so much for all that you've done for us.
To respond to that and say, I want to, it's a mutual relationship, because we are only able to do the work that we do because of the generosity of people in communities like yours. And also the generosity of scientists who spend a lot of time answering our very basic questions. We wouldn't be able to do our work without you, so thank you.
Rennie in the back, I believe.
Rennie Cushing, I'm a state representative from New Hampshire, and so much of things happen these days in a fact-free zone, or news takes place in a fact-free zone, and it's really difficult when you're engaged in politics to have that be part of the echo. Being in the state legislature, I'm always reminded of what my grandfather told me when I was little, that in the barnyard, the hogs closest to the trough get the most slops. And what doesn't get reported often enough is kind of the pernicious influence that money has and corporations have on our political process. So while things are happening in the streets and happening in the communities, decisions that are being made are taking place behind closed doors in the state houses and in the legislature. That's part of the bigger story that has to fit in the context of what I know you're trying to recover. And I can't help but think, you talked about Dr. Chan's, who's the epidemiologist she reported on. Well, he goes around and he makes presentations, of course, and the slide shows that in the slides that he uses are the slides that were prepared by 3M. So that's kind of a way that he gets sourced. Anyways. He's an epidemiologist. He's not an epidemiologist. Anyways.
Thank you. We're actually going back here and then we'll come back.
Maybe I can talk louder.
Sure.
I think that some of what people have been wanting here is certainty about effects, and beyond certainty will be some sort of exactitude about the levels. I think we have to accept that certainty is unlikely in the near future. After all, if we go back to those 1981 studies, we've had 36 years of study. What makes us think certainty will arise soon? And we have this complex levels on all these chemicals. What makes us think that we will suddenly be able to exactly know what sort of level of each and how they add up, and in a couple of years be able to have a nice decision that everyone can say this water is safe? But we are always, as people, making complex decisions with incomplete information. We do it about finance, we do it in elections, we do it in all sorts of things. Humans are actually quite good at that. And I think that, and we have been studying this in other situations. We started in P4 and we've gone on to other things. Well, it's more a comment than a question, but it's that the more you can help with journalism, the more you can help people make their own wise decisions, the better it is. Because water, what we drink, is something each individual determines. So don't hope for science to give you that certainty and exactitude that realistically you can't expect. Help us get people to make wise decisions in the absence of all the information.
Thank you. We're going to come to the front.
This is on. So I went to dinner last night with my family after being at this conference all day yesterday and tried to explain what happened here. And I realized that it's really difficult to talk about these chemicals. And as folks who write for a very broad audience, I wonder if you have any advice on how you talk about a very scientific thing for everyday people.
Well, I'll just say, I think you just hit the issue on the nose. And I mean, as far as I'm concerned, in a way, it's really important to be able to communicate the science to the people, but more than that is the communication of the science to the policymakers. And that's the giant gaping gap that I think is creating problems like we have now. I'm just going to pass this.
Yeah, I would just add in terms of gaps. It depends on the story you want to tell. We were telling a lot of different stories yesterday. And often, I'll do interviews. People interview me sometimes after a big piece comes out. And a couple times I've been on our local WNYC, our NPR affiliate. And I'll go into, sometimes they'll all get a half an hour, and you go, you explain the documents, and you explain, you try to add the complexity, and invariably, one of the first calls is, are my pants safe? The callers say, okay, thanks, are my pants safe? And so I feel like there is one part of the story is my pants safe, and is my water safe? And another part of the story that I have been trying to get at is this question of uncertainty. You can't ever know what causes your cancer, and we keep talking about that, but what you can know is that you don't know, and you can know risks, and you can know about epidemiology, and that's I've been trying, part of the reason that some of my pieces go on and on is I'm attempting to get at that sort of complexity, that it's, the story is not just this is the level, but, this is the history that got us to where we are. And so when you're talking to your family, you maybe need to tell them a little bit about the history and a little bit, really about the fact that these are off the regulatory map right now. And that's why we're having so many problems, because there aren't laws that pertain to them.
So in my experience, this is unusual in terms of an environmental health story, in that there are these very, very compelling human stories, right? There are a lot of sort of heroic figures in this story. And I find when I explain the history to people by telling those stories, they really get it. I also think it's important for a lot of people in this room to understand the complexity of the science. But it's not necessary for the public to understand a lot of that complexity. And in some ways, this is a simpler story because the data at this point is fairly strong. And it's also, I think, the fact that always grabs people's attention when I talk about it is the fact that virtually every person on the planet has this chemical in their blood. So a lot of environmental health stories are environmental justice stories where it's one community or one type of community that's affected. Everybody is affected, and I think that's something that makes this very compelling to people when we talk about it and write about it. So, but I really do think that the human stories are key, and we heard from a lot of people in the last couple of days who have just really moving, powerful stories to tell. So that's my 2 cents.
We have one in the way back.
Start with that. I also, Emily, thank you so much for bringing up this issue of, not willing to come out with the information about the facts. And because we find this all the time when students are learning about breast cancer and whatnot, then they go to their doctors and say there's absolutely no connection, or they go to the Susan G. Komen and there's absolutely no connection. And so that's a really important point. I want to thank you. The journalism, this is what we need more than anything else. And the people that are here in this room who are posting on Twitter, that's what we need more than anything else. We wrote an article and posted this morning. Anything that we can do to get the message out that this is a science-based story. And yes, the human stories are great and important, but the more we can share about the science, the more community will come with it. So I just want to thank you, and I also want to make sure that we repost your articles, that we send out links, even though the articles have been a while, that we keep doing that. And if every single person in this room with your 1,000 followers on Facebook or your 50 followers on Facebook did the same thing, we would have that much a larger audience. So thank you, and we will make sure that we do that.
Thank you.
We're going to go to the woman in the red jacket and then over here.
As more communities come together and more spots are identified that with contamination, what would you recommend to tell these new towns that are very hyper-local region to work and better utilize their own local media? Like, how do they even get their foot in the door to get their local media's ear?
It's a really good question. I mean, we get inundated with press releases, but well-written press releases that tell you what's at stake and convince me that I am not going to be doing the marketing bidding of somebody else are pretty effective. And so, you know, tips are like, what's at stake, who's affected and what's their story, and why, like, has this really not been covered before by somebody else? Like, how is this an opportunity for a reporter to be making an impact? Those are things that I think people look for.
Yeah, and I would add, you know, I'm slightly different because we're a national publication, and it's sort of reversed for me. What I don't want is a press release. What I usually want is someone to email me, Sharon.Lerner@theintercept.com, and I want them, you know, and that's really the best way, and just tell me what's going on, you know, and it is often like, if it's been covered by 15 people, you know, I'm not going to cover it, or at least I'm not going to cover it that way, but it might be part of a bigger story, or it might be, or maybe you're experiencing something that other people aren't, and I just, you know, I feel like a call or an email is always the best way for me.
That's totally true for me too, actually. I mean, I think of, when someone asks me that question, I just think of people who have to write press releases, but a call is way better.
Yeah, it almost like guarantees that I won't cover it if I get a press release, which is awful, but it's.
I just want to add that communities today are in a different position than, you know, Parkersburg was, or even Hoosick Falls was, when they were trying to get media attention to this issue in the beginning, because there's a lot of national media out there. And I think that you can use that to your advantage, right? That this is kind of a big national story now, if you're trying to get media attention. The fact that there's a cover story in the New York Times about New York Times Magazine. I think that previously a local journalist might get this and not know whether the substance was really dangerous or not. But I think there's enough reporting out there that establishes, you know, that there's very concerning data about the health effects, and that there is this very sort of troubling history with this chemical, or with this family of chemicals, that makes it easier to get local media attention.
Great. The gentleman in the way back, I'm sorry.
The thing that I want to ask about is that how do you get your news out to the remote areas? So our area is contaminated, but we have huge swaths of land where people live that they have zero internet access, no satellite, anything. They're pretty much living in the dark ages, waiting on newspapers, if even that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, how do you get news? You get newspapers, is that right?
We do have some local newspapers.
Yeah, I mean,
That's a tough one.
I don't work for a local newspaper. I know that our local newspapers have covered this to a degree, maybe not super deeply. It's a really good question. I'm so, like, I can't even imagine living without the internet. It's just, I'm almost paralyzed by the question.
Well, we're actually out to bring awareness to that, because a lot of us who live in the cities and urban areas, we over time become so accustomed to it that we don't even realize that we do have swaths without this technology.
Yeah, I don't have anything except
Local community
pretty
radio.
much. Say it again.
Local community radio. Do they tune in? They can start. Go look that up. You know, forget Google.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I'm going to go to this gentleman here.
Thank you. I really just wanted to take the opportunity to be on the other side of the table and ask questions. I'm always answering them. And I love to see the great stories and the great coverage. And I think this discussion about uncertainty and the complexity of this story and all these stories, especially with respect to chemical exposure, is extremely interesting and difficult to get across. And really the human element, in some ways, as Mariah said, makes the story a little bit easier and more compelling. The pictures and acute effects are ones that really stand out. But for many of these chemicals, we're looking at long-term health impacts, potential effects that don't have those same visuals. And so even in this case, is there enough compelling information and stories with C8 to extend this to our concerns about the shorter chain chemicals? Will that carry some of the story? What is there without, do we have to wait till there's visuals of human harm from the replacement chemicals before the story becomes compelling enough for national attention? It's also a question for many of these other chemicals that we're looking at that may have similar health impacts.
So as part of I am writing a book that focuses largely on PFOA, but the later chapters will deal a lot with the shorter chain chemicals because I see it as all part of one story. I think it's probably hard to get people to focus a lot of attention on the shorter chain chemicals, but if you see it as, I'm interested in this whole phenomenon of regrettable substitution, which you see in a lot of classes of chemicals, and I think that is a very interesting and compelling part of the story that I think both Sharon and I addressed in our original reporting on this, and that I intend to continue addressing in my book. So,
can I add on that? So I was grappling, I'm sure as we all have been, with this question of how to deal with uncertainty when I was first beginning to write those 3 pieces. And in the process, remember I was coming to this as a New Jersey story. In the process, as I was figuring out, it was really about West Virginia, I actually figured out that my father-in-law, who's from West Virginia, had worked at the DuPont plant on and off for 20 years. He also died of prostate cancer at age 63. And I read the 3M study that said people with a family history of prostate cancer who are exposed have 3 times the chance of mortality. And that's him, right? So there it is. I was like, okay, I was kind of thinking this is too unclear, and there it was. Like, did he die from that? I have no idea. No one will ever have any idea, right? He wouldn't have fit into the class action lawsuit, but it's entirely possible it affected his body in a way that, hastened or brought about his death. So there it is. And like, does that piss me off? Like, yeah, and does anyone deserve to deal with that uncertainty? No. So to me, like, you just kind of put the line behind me. Like that, yes, it's all unclear, and it's not okay.
We have about 2 minutes. Gentleman in the back.
So I'm Joel Ticker. I'm a faculty member at UMass Lowell. My area is safer chemistry. Actually, I work a lot on regrettable substitutions and how do we move away from, problem chemicals to safer alternatives. Actually, Gary Davis and I, 20 years ago, did a whole set of training for communities on how to think about cleaner products and cleaner technologies, and we've sort of lost that and are coming back to it. So I guess one of the questions, and I spent much of my career studying how bad things are and working on these things and talking to reporters about how bad phthalates are, we need to get them on a product, blah, blah, blah. So my question for you as reporters is, it's been incredibly difficult to get the positive stories out there, right? Investment in safer chemistry is minuscule compared to the investment in studying how bad problems are. So how do we get the message out there when we have positive stories that we need to replicate them, grow them, get more money into it so that we don't have to keep on coming back here and seeing every contaminated community because we're designing chemistries that are inherently safer?
Go for it.
I'm eager to write a positive story. What would that be like? No, I am, and you know, and but you know, going back to the press release thing, you know, it would never for me be like, here's this new product, come buy it, you know. But of course, that there's room for that, and solutions-oriented journalism, I think, is
Because
critical.
what you do drives my ability to work with the marketplace to move safer chemistry, right? You know, why is Walmart, and Target doing things? Because the stories drive the advocacy campaigns that drive them. So I can go into the chemical industry now and say, I don't have to make a scientific case anymore because Walmart's made it for you. I don't really care. We can debate ad nauseum how toxic this is. Walmart doesn't want it anymore. So we need to move to alternatives. So your reporting has that value, that important value, and now we have to sort of make that case, you know, for more of the solution.
Okay, so one last, did you have a question in the back here? No? Okay, sure. Well, we just wanted to thank the three of you for coming. You're writing your journalism. It's not just about that, it's about the investigative and the research work and the hours and hours it's going to put into it. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your stories.